Sometimes the most powerful moments in
Prepare for
our
immediate
lives come not
departure.
from grand
Check your
gestures,
gear and
but
secure the
from
area.
quiet acts of recognition. In a world where respect must often be earned through struggle, one woman's journey to claim her rightful place would challenge everything her colleagues thought they knew about courage, sacrifice, and what it truly means to serve. Her story begins not with fanfare, but with a simple denial that would change everything and reveal the extraordinary power of a single emblem to rewrite the rules of respect. What happens when years of dedicated service collide with a moment of dismissal? When the very people sworn to protect and serve fail to recognize one of their own? This is the story of a woman whose quiet strength would eventually command the attention of the highest ranks, proving that true valor doesn't always come in the uniform others expect to see. The morning air at Fort Campbell carried the familiar scent of jet fuel and determination. Sarah Martinez adjusted her civilian jacket as she approached the flight line, her weathered hands clutching a worn leather portfolio that had seen more missions than most soldiers see in a lifetime. At 52, she moved with the purposeful stride of someone who had learned to navigate military installations with quiet confidence, even when that confidence wasn't always welcomed by others. The Black Hawk helicopter sat on the tarmac like a sleeping giant, its rotors still and cockpit gleaming in the early Kentucky sunlight. Sarah had seen hundreds of these aircraft over the years, had worked on their engines until her hands were permanently stained with grease, had watched them lift off carrying precious cargo and brave souls into uncertain skies. Today, she was supposed to be that cargo herself. Sergeant First Class Mike Thompson emerged from the aircraft's side door, clipboard in hand, and authority written across his broad shoulders. Behind him followed two other crew members, their flight suits pristine and their movements sharp with military precision. Sarah recognized the type immediately, young soldiers who had learned their craft well, but hadn't yet learned that experience could come in many different packages. She approached the group with measured steps, her civilian clothes marking her as an outsider in their world of uniformed efficiency. Thompson looked up from his checklist, his eyes briefly scanning her appearance before settling on her face with polite but distant professionalism. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step back from the aircraft," Thompson said, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "This is a military flight preparation area. Authorized personnel only." Sarah paused, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. She had expected this moment, had prepared for it even, but it still stung with the familiar weight of assumptions made and respect withheld. "I'm Sarah Martinez," she said simply, extending her credentials toward the sergeant. "I'm scheduled for the flight to Kandahar." Thompson glanced at the documents without really seeing them, his attention already divided between her presence and the mental checklist running through his head. "Look, ma'am, I appreciate whatever clearance you think you have, but we're running a tight operation here. This isn't a civilian transport. We're carrying critical personnel only." The words hung in the air between them like an unspoken challenge. Sarah felt the familiar tension that came with being underestimated, the weight of having to prove herself in spaces where her presence was questioned before her qualifications were even considered. She had spent decades in these moments, learning to navigate the careful balance between assertiveness and patience that came with being a woman in military circles. "I understand your concerns, Sergeant," Sarah replied, her voice steady and calm. "But if you check your manifest, you'll see that I'm listed as essential personnel for this mission. I've been contracted by the Department of Defense as a technical advisor for aircraft maintenance operations in the field." Behind Thompson, one of the younger crew members snorted softly, the sound barely audible but loaded with skepticism. Sarah caught the gesture and felt the old familiar fire kindle in her chest, the same feeling that had driven her to excel in every job she had ever taken, every challenge she had ever faced. Thompson finally looked at the paperwork properly, his eyes scanning the official seals and signatures with growing uncertainty. The credentials were legitimate, the authorization clear and properly documented. But something in his expression suggested that what he was seeing didn't match what he had expected to see. "Ma'am, these papers look fine, but I have to ask," Thompson said, his voice taking on a slightly different tone, one that suggested he was trying to be diplomatic while still maintaining his authority. Do you have any actual military experience? This isn't going to be a smooth civilian flight. We're talking about a combat zone deployment, hot landing zones, potential hostile activity. It's not exactly the kind of environment where we can babysit civilians who don't understand the risks involved. The assumption behind his words was clear, and Sarah felt the weight of every similar conversation she had endured over the years. The presumption that her civilian clothes meant civilian inexperience, that her presence would be a burden rather than an asset, that someone like her couldn't possibly understand the realities of military operations. She looked past Thompson toward the Black Hawk, noting the way its crew was preparing for what would undoubtedly be a routine flight for them, but which represented something more significant for her. This wasn't just about getting from point A to point B. This was about being recognized for who she was and what she brought to the table, rather than being dismissed for what others assumed she wasn't. "Sergeant Thompson," Sarah said, her voice carrying just enough edge to command attention without crossing into confrontation. "I appreciate your concern for safety and mission integrity. Those are exactly the qualities that make good soldiers. But I think you might be making some assumptions about my background that aren't quite accurate." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle before continuing. "I've been working with military aircraft longer than some of your crew members have been alive. I've deployed to more combat zones than I care to count, worked under fire, slept in bunkers, and fixed helicopters that other people said couldn't be fixed. I'm not here as a tourist, and I'm not here because someone thought it would be nice to give a civilian a ride in a military aircraft." Thompson's expression shifted slightly, the first crack in his confident assessment of the situation. Behind him, the other crew members had stopped their preparations to listen, drawn by the quiet authority in Sarah's voice that suggested there was more to this conversation than met the eye. "The fact is," Sarah continued, "the aircraft you're preparing to fly has a recurring maintenance issue with its tail rotor assembly that's been documented but not properly addressed. The repair manuals suggest one approach, but field experience suggests another. I'm here because when that problem manifests itself in the middle of a combat zone, you're going to want someone who knows how to fix it with whatever tools and parts happen to be available, rather than waiting for the proper equipment to arrive from the States." She gestured toward the Black Hawk with the familiarity of someone who had spent countless hours inside similar aircraft, working in cramped spaces with inadequate lighting and improvised solutions. "I'm also here because the maintenance crews at Kandahar have been dealing with a 60% availability rate on their rotary wing aircraft, which means that missions are being delayed, soldiers are missing transport opportunities, and people who need help aren't getting it because the birds can't stay in the air." Thompson looked at his checklist again, then back at Sarah with a new awareness that his initial assessment might have been incomplete. The confidence in her voice, the specificity of her knowledge, and the way she spoke about military operations suggested a level of experience that didn't match the civilian clothes and middle-aged woman standing before him. "Ma'am, I'm not trying to be difficult," Thompson said, his tone shifting towards something more respectful, though still cautious. "But I have my orders about who can and can't fly on this aircraft. If there's been some kind of miscommunication, or if you need to speak with someone higher up the chain of command to clarify your authorization, I'm happy to help you make those contacts. But right now, based on what I'm seeing, I can't authorize you to board this aircraft." Sarah nodded, understanding the position he was in even as frustration built in her chest. She had been through this dance too many times before, the careful choreography of military protocol that often valued appearance over substance, rank over expertise. She knew that Thompson was doing his job as he understood it, following the rules as they had been explained to him. But she also knew that sometimes the rules didn't account for every situation, didn't anticipate every scenario where experience and expertise might come in packages that didn't fit the expected mold. She had spent her career proving that competence could exist outside the traditional military structure, that value could be found in unlikely places. The sun was climbing higher now, and Sarah could see other aircraft preparing for departure across the flight line. Time was becoming a factor, and she knew that every minute spent in this conversation was a minute closer to missing the scheduled departure that would put her where she needed to be when the soldiers at Kandahar needed her most. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts, looking for the right person to call, someone who could verify her credentials and clear up the confusion that was keeping her grounded. But even as she searched, she felt the familiar weight of having to justify her presence, having to prove her worth to people who should have been able to see it from the start. The irony wasn't lost on her that she had spent decades fixing the very aircraft that were now being used to keep her from doing her job. She had worked in hangars and on flight lines, had gotten her hands dirty maintaining the machines that kept soldiers safe and missions successful. Yet here she stood, treated as an outsider in the world where she had always belonged. Thompson watched her with growing uncertainty, clearly beginning to suspect that this situation was more complicated than he had initially assumed. The woman standing before him didn't fit the profile of someone who would try to bluff her way onto a military aircraft, and the confidence with which she spoke about technical details suggested knowledge that couldn't be faked. As Sarah continued to search for the right contact, she couldn't help but think about all the other times she had faced similar challenges, all the moments when her expertise had been questioned before it was recognized. She thought about the young mechanics she had trained over the years, many of whom had gone on to successful military careers while she remained in the civilian contractor world that valued her skills, but often overlooked her contributions. The morning sun grew warmer, and the sounds of military activity continued around them as other aircraft prepared for their own missions. Sarah knew that this moment, like so many others in her career, would either result in recognition of her value or in another instance of being overlooked because she didn't fit the expected image of military competence. She looked up from her phone and met Thompson's eyes directly, seeing in them the same uncertainty that she had learned to navigate throughout her career. "Sergeant," she said quietly, "I understand your position, and I respect your commitment to following protocol. But I need you to understand that this isn't about me wanting a ride on a military aircraft. This is about soldiers in Afghanistan who need equipment that works, and about aircraft that need someone who knows how to keep them flying when the manual solutions don't work and the supply chain breaks down." The conversation had reached a crossroads, and Sarah could sense that what happened next would determine not just whether she made her flight, but whether this would be another moment of being overlooked or the beginning of something different. The tension on the flight line was broken by the distinctive sound of military boots approaching with purpose across the tarmac. Sarah looked up from her phone to see a figure striding toward them, his uniform bearing the silver eagles of a full colonel, and his bearing suggesting someone accustomed to having his presence felt before his words were heard. Colonel James Mitchell had been at Fort Campbell for less than 6 months, but his reputation had preceded him from his previous assignment at Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan. He was known as an officer who valued results over protocol when the two came into conflict, and who had earned the respect of his subordinates by demonstrating that he understood the difference between following rules and accomplishing missions. Mitchell's eyes took in the scene quickly, noting the civilian woman standing confidently despite being clearly excluded from the military preparation happening around her, the sergeant who appeared caught between duty and uncertainty, and the crew members who had stopped their work to observe what was clearly becoming an unusual situation. "Sergeant Thompson," Mitchell said as he approached, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came not from rank alone but from years of making decisions that affected real lives in real situations. "Is there a problem here?" Thompson snapped to attention, his uncertainty becoming even more apparent now that senior leadership had arrived to witness what might be either a security issue or a breakdown in communication. "Sir, we have a civilian who claims to be authorized for transport to Kandahar, but her credentials don't match our manifest expectations, and I have concerns about transporting non-military personnel into a combat environment without proper clearance." The colonel's gaze shifted to Sarah, and she felt the familiar weight of being assessed by someone with significant decision-making power. But there was something different in Mitchell's expression, something that suggested he was looking at her with genuine attention rather than predetermined assumptions. "Ma'am," Mitchell said, his tone respectful but direct, "I'm Colonel Mitchell, commanding officer for Rotary Wing operations here at Campbell. Sergeant Thompson indicates there's some confusion about your authorization for this flight. Can you help me understand the situation?" Sarah straightened, recognizing in Mitchell's approach the kind of leadership that she had learned to respect over her years of working with military personnel. He wasn't dismissing her concerns or rushing to judgment, but rather seeking to understand the facts before making decisions. Colonel, I'm Sarah Martinez, contracted by the Department of Defense as a technical advisor for aircraft maintenance operations, she replied, handing him her credentials with the same confidence she had shown to Thompson, but now with the added assurance that came from dealing with someone who appeared willing to actually examine the evidence before him. Mitchell took the documents and reviewed them with the careful attention of someone who understood that details mattered in military operations. His eyes moved methodically through the authorization papers, the technical certifications, and the official seals that validated Sarah's claim to be exactly who she said she was. These credentials appear to be in order, Mitchell said after completing his review, but his tone suggested he was looking for more information rather than simply validating paperwork. Can you tell me more about the nature of your mission at Kandahar? Sarah recognized this as the moment where her expertise would either be acknowledged or dismissed based on how well she could communicate the value she brought to the military operation. She had learned over the years that technical knowledge was only valuable if it could be translated into terms that decision-makers could understand and appreciate. Sir, the maintenance units at Kandahar are experiencing significant challenges with helicopter availability rates, she began, choosing her words carefully to convey both the scope of the problem and the specificity of her solution. The primary issues involve adaptive maintenance techniques for field conditions that differ significantly from depot-level repair protocols. Standard maintenance procedures assume access to specific tools and parts that aren't always available in forward operating environments. She paused, noting that Mitchell was listening with the kind of focused attention that suggested genuine interest in understanding the technical aspects of what she was describing. Behind him, Thompson and the crew members were also listening, though their expressions suggested varying levels of comprehension and engagement. The result is that aircraft are being taken out of service for issues that could be resolved with field modifications and adaptive repair techniques. But the current maintenance crews haven't been trained on these approaches because they're not part of standard military technical manuals, Sarah continued. I've been working with similar aircraft systems for over 20 years, including multiple deployments in similar environments, and I've developed techniques for keeping aircraft operational under conditions where traditional repair methods aren't feasible. Mitchell nodded slowly, his expression indicating that he was beginning to understand not just what Sarah did, but why it mattered for the mission he was supporting. These adaptive techniques, are they documented anywhere, or is this primarily experiential knowledge? It's a combination, sir, Sarah replied. Some of the modifications have been documented through after-action reports and technical bulletins, but much of it is experiential knowledge that comes from working on aircraft in the field under combat conditions. The challenge is that this kind of knowledge is difficult to transfer through traditional training programs, which is why the Department of Defense contracts experienced technicians to work directly with maintenance units in deployed environments. She gestured toward the Black Hawk behind them, using it as a visual reference for the kind of aircraft systems she was discussing. For example, this particular aircraft model has a recurring issue with vibration in the tail rotor assembly that typically requires specific balancing equipment to resolve. But, in field conditions, that equipment isn't always available, and aircraft can be grounded for weeks waiting for the proper tools to arrive. With adaptive techniques, the same issue can often be resolved using improvised balancing methods and field modifications that keep the aircraft operational until proper depot maintenance can be performed. Colonel Mitchell's expression had shifted during Sarah's explanation, and she could see that he was beginning to understand the strategic value of what she was offering. Military leaders at his level were constantly balancing resource constraints against mission requirements, and the idea of keeping aircraft operational through innovative maintenance approaches clearly resonated with his operational priorities. Ms. Martinez, Mitchell said, and Sarah noted the shift to a more formal address that suggested increased respect for her professional standing. How many deployments have you completed in support of military operations? The question was clearly intended to assess her level of experience with the realities of military deployment, and Sarah answered with the straightforward honesty that she had learned was most effective with military leadership. This will be my 8th deployment since 2003, sir. Previous deployments included Iraq, Afghanistan, and several shorter assignments supporting special operations units. Total time in combat environments is approximately 4 years. Thompson's expression changed noticeably at this information, and Sarah could see him reassessing his initial judgment about her suitability for military transport. The other crew members were also showing increased interest, clearly beginning to understand that the civilian woman they had been prepared to dismiss had more combat experience than some of the soldiers they worked with regularly. Mitchell looked back at the authorization papers, then at Sarah, then at his sergeant, who was clearly struggling to reconcile his initial assumptions with the information he was now hearing. "Sergeant Thompson, what specific concerns do you have about Ms. Martinez's transport on this aircraft?" Thompson straightened, clearly aware that his commanding officer was asking him to justify his decision in light of new information. "Sir, my primary concern was ensuring that we weren't transporting civilians who might not understand the security requirements and safety protocols associated with military flight operations in potentially hostile environments." The paperwork appeared legitimate, but without additional verification, I felt it was appropriate to err on the side of caution. It was a diplomatic answer that acknowledged both his duty to follow security protocols and his growing awareness that his initial assessment might have been incomplete. Mitchell nodded, recognizing the sergeant's attempt to balance multiple responsibilities while adapting to new information. "That's good judgment under normal circumstances, Sergeant," Mitchell said. "But I think we have some additional information now that changes the parameters of the situation." The colonel turned back to Sarah with an expression that suggested he was moving from assessment to decision-making mode. "Ms. Martinez, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I need you to give me a direct answer. In your professional assessment, how critical is your presence at Kandahar for maintaining aircraft availability rates?" Sarah appreciated the straightforward nature of the question and responded with equal directness. "Colonel, based on the reports I've received from the maintenance units at Kandahar, aircraft availability is currently running at approximately 60%, which means that roughly 40% of scheduled missions are either delayed or canceled due to mechanical issues. In my experience, field modifications and adaptive maintenance techniques can typically improve availability rates to approximately 85% within the first month of implementation." She paused, allowing the numerical impact of her statement to register before continuing. "That difference represents additional transport capability that could mean the difference between soldiers receiving supplies and support on schedule versus waiting for the next available aircraft. In a combat environment, that timing can be critical for mission success and personnel safety." Mitchell was clearly processing the strategic implications of what Sarah was describing. A 25% improvement in aircraft availability represented significant additional operational capability, the kind of force multiplier that experienced military leaders learn to recognize and prioritize. "The techniques you're describing," Mitchell said, "are they something that can be taught to our existing maintenance personnel, or do they require your continuous presence to implement?" "Both, sir," Sarah replied. "Some of the techniques can be taught and documented for ongoing use by local maintenance crews. But some of the problem-solving approaches require experience with multiple aircraft types and field conditions that can only be developed over time. My role is to work with the maintenance teams to address immediate availability issues while training them on techniques they can use independently for similar problems in the future." The morning sun was now fully up, and Sarah could hear the increasing activity around them as other aircraft prepared for their scheduled departures. The conversation had evolved from a simple authorization dispute to a discussion of operational priorities and mission effectiveness. Mitchell looked at his watch, clearly aware that time was becoming a factor in whatever decision he was going to make. "Sergeant Thompson, please review Ms. Martinez's paperwork one more time and confirm that all required authorizations are present and properly documented." Thompson took the documents and reviewed them again, this time with the increased attention that came from understanding that his commanding officer was clearly taking the situation seriously. After a thorough examination, he looked up with an expression that suggested recognition of what he should have seen the first time. "Sir, all authorizations appear to be complete and properly documented. The paperwork includes clearances from Department of Defense contracting, security clearances appropriate for the deployment location, and medical certifications for deployment to combat environments. Everything appears to be in order. Mitchell nodded, then looked back at Sarah with an expression that suggested he was moving toward a conclusion. But Sarah could sense that there was still something else he wanted to understand before making his final decision about her transport authorization. Colonel Mitchell studied Sarah with the careful attention of someone who sensed there were layers to this situation that hadn't yet been revealed. His years of military leadership had taught him to look beyond surface appearances, to understand that in the complex world of modern military operations, expertise and experience could come from unexpected sources. Ms. Martinez, Mitchell said, his tone becoming more conversational while maintaining the respectful formality appropriate to their professional relationship. I have to admit that your background is more extensive than what we typically see from civilian contractors. Most technical advisors come to us from defense industry positions or academic backgrounds. Your experience profile suggests something different. Sarah felt the familiar moment of decision that she had faced countless times throughout her career. She could continue to let her civilian contractor status speak for itself, maintaining the professional distance that came with being an outsider brought in for specific expertise. Or she could reveal the part of her background that she had learned to keep private unless circumstances specifically required its disclosure. The morning air carried the sounds of military efficiency around them as other aircraft prepared for departure, crews running through their checklists with practiced precision. Sarah looked past Mitchell toward the horizon where other Black Hawks were lifting off, their rotors cutting through the Kentucky sky with the purposeful power that she had always found both beautiful and inspiring. "Colonel," Sarah said, making the decision to trust this moment and this officer with the full truth of who she was. "There's something about my background that might help explain why I've been able to work effectively with military units in deployed environments." She reached into her jacket and withdrew a small leather wallet, the kind of worn accessory that spoke of years of careful handling and personal significance. From within the wallet, she extracted a small emblem, its metal surface dulled by time but its significance unmistakable to anyone familiar with military recognition symbols. The emblem showed wings spread above a shield, with crossed tools beneath, and a banner bearing Latin text that most civilians would never recognize. But Mitchell's expression changed immediately upon seeing it, his eyes focusing on the symbol with the sharp attention of someone who understood exactly what he was looking at. "Master Sergeant Sarah Martinez, United States Air Force, retired," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying the pride and dignity that came with 24 years of military service. "Aircraft maintenance operations, multiple combat deployments, retired 2019. The silence that followed her revelation was filled with the sound of rotor blades and jet engines. But Sarah could feel the shift in atmosphere as profoundly as if the entire flight line had suddenly gone quiet. Thompson's expression transformed from cautious confusion to something approaching embarrassment, while the crew members behind him straightened with the automatic respect that came from recognizing a senior non-commissioned officer who had earned her rank through decades of demonstrated competence. Colonel Mitchell looked at the emblem in Sarah's hand, then back at her face, clearly reassessing everything about the conversation that had just taken place. "Master Sergeant," he said, and the shift in his tone carried both respect and what might have been a touch of frustration at the misunderstanding that had occurred. "May I ask why you didn't mention your military service when this situation first arose?" Sarah replaced the emblem in her wallet with the careful attention of someone handling something precious. "Sir, I learned early in my civilian contracting career that leading with my military background can sometimes complicate working relationships with active duty personnel. Some people assume that retired service members are trying to leverage their former status for respect they haven't earned in their current role. Others assume that military retirees are stuck in old ways of thinking and can't adapt to current operational requirements." She paused, looking directly at Thompson with an expression that held no resentment, but carried the weight of experience. "I found it more effective to establish my credentials based on current competence rather than past service. If I can prove my value through what I know and what I can do, then people work with me because I'm useful, not because they feel obligated to show respect for former service." Mitchell nodded slowly, clearly understanding the complex dynamics that Sarah was describing. Military culture placed enormous value on rank and service, but it also valued current contribution and competence. Navigating the balance between honoring past service and proving current worth was a challenge that many military retirees faced when transitioning to civilian contractor roles. Master Sergeant, Mitchell said, using her former rank with the natural ease of someone who understood military protocol. With respect, I think you may have underestimated the value of full transparency in this particular situation. Sergeant Thompson was doing his job correctly by questioning civilian access to military aircraft. If he had understood from the beginning that he was dealing with a retired Air Force maintenance professional with combat experience, this entire conversation could have been avoided. Thompson stepped forward slightly, his expression showing the kind of respectful attention that junior non-commissioned officers typically show to senior enlisted personnel, even those who had transitioned to civilian status. Master Sergeant, with your permission, I'd like to apologize for the assumptions I made. If I had understood your background, I would have approached this situation very differently. Sarah looked at the young sergeant with the understanding that came from having been in his position herself many years earlier. Sergeant Thompson, you did your job exactly as you should have. You followed proper security protocols and questioned someone whose credentials didn't match your expectations. That's good military discipline, and I respect you for it. She gestured toward the Black Hawk behind them, using it as a reference point for the broader context of what they were all trying to accomplish. The only thing I would suggest is that experience doesn't always come in the package you expect to see. I've learned over the years that some of the best mechanics I've worked with were people who didn't fit the traditional image of what a military technician looks like. Competence comes in many forms, and sometimes the most valuable experience comes from people who have learned to adapt to working outside traditional military structures. Colonel Mitchell was clearly processing not just the information about Sarah's background, but the broader implications of the misunderstanding that had occurred. Master Sergeant, your point about experience coming in unexpected packages is well taken. But I'm curious about something else. Given your background and experience level, why are you working as a civilian contractor rather than remaining in active service? 24 years suggests you could have continued to retirement at 30. The question touched on one of the most significant decisions Sarah had made in her professional life, and she answered with the honest reflection that such decisions deserved. Sir, I retired from active service because I reached a point where I felt I could make a greater contribution working outside the traditional military structure. As a senior NCO, I was spending more time on administrative duties and less time actually working on aircraft. As a civilian contractor, I can focus entirely on the technical work that I'm best at while also having the flexibility to work with different units and address specific capability gaps. She looked toward the aircraft around them, her expression showing the deep familiarity and affection that came from a lifetime of working with military aviation. I also wanted the opportunity to share what I've learned with younger mechanics who are just starting their careers. In the military, knowledge transfer typically happens within formal training programs and established career progression paths. As a contractor, I can work directly with maintenance teams to address specific problems while teaching techniques that might not be covered in standard technical manuals. Mitchell nodded, recognizing the professional motivations that Sarah was describing. Military leadership at his level understood that some of their most experienced personnel eventually found ways to continue serving that didn't require remaining within traditional military career structures. The techniques you mentioned earlier, Mitchell said, the adaptive maintenance approaches that can improve aircraft availability rates. Are these techniques that you developed during your active service, or are they something you've developed since transitioning to contractor status? Both, sir, Sarah replied. Many of the basic approaches were developed during my active service deployments, particularly in Iraq and Afghanistan, where we had to keep aircraft operational under conditions that weren't covered in standard maintenance procedures. But I've been able to refine and expand these techniques through my contractor work because I've had the opportunity to work with different aircraft types and different maintenance organizations. She paused, considering how to explain the evolution of her expertise in terms that would resonate with Mitchell's understanding of military operations. In active service, You're typically focused on maintaining specific aircraft for specific units under specific operational conditions. As a contractor, I've been able to work with multiple aircraft types across different operational environments, which has given me a broader perspective on how maintenance challenges vary and how solutions can be adapted to different situations. The conversation had evolved far beyond the simple question of authorization for transport. Sarah could see that Mitchell was beginning to understand not just her qualifications for the specific mission to Kandahar, but the broader value she represented as a resource for military aviation operations. Thompson stepped forward again, his expression showing the kind of professional curiosity that came from recognizing expertise that could be valuable for his own development. Master Sergeant, if I may ask, what would you say is the most important lesson you've learned about aircraft maintenance that isn't taught in standard technical training? Sarah smiled, recognizing in Thompson's question the genuine desire to learn that she had always tried to encourage in younger mechanics. Sergeant, the most important thing I've learned is that aircraft are systems, not just collections of individual components. When something breaks, the solution isn't always to replace the broken part. Sometimes the solution is to understand why that part broke and address the underlying system issue that caused the failure. She gestured toward the Black Hawk again, using it as a visual aid for her explanation. For example, if you have recurring problems with rotor blade tracking, the standard response is to adjust the tracking according to the technical manual procedures. But if the problem keeps coming back, you need to look at things like engine mount stability, transmission alignment, and even how the aircraft is being operated. The real solution might involve addressing issues that seem completely unrelated to the original problem. Mitchell and Thompson were both listening with the focused attention that came from recognizing practical wisdom that could be immediately applied to their current responsibilities. The other crew members had also moved closer, drawn by the discussion of technical issues that directly related to their daily work. That kind of systems thinking, Mitchell said, is exactly the kind of expertise that can make the difference between adequate maintenance performance and exceptional maintenance performance. It's also exactly the kind of knowledge that's difficult to transfer through traditional training programs. Sarah nodded, pleased that Mitchell understood both the value and the challenge of transferring experiential knowledge. That's why the Department of Defense continues to contract with experienced technicians for deployed operations, sir. Some kinds of knowledge can only be gained through hands-on experience with multiple aircraft types under varying operational conditions. The morning sun had climbed higher, and Sarah could see that other aircraft were beginning to complete their preparations for departure. The conversation that had begun with a simple authorization question had evolved into something much more significant. But she was aware that practical considerations of flight schedules and mission timelines were becoming increasingly important. Colonel Mitchell glanced at his watch and then looked back at Sarah with an expression that suggested he was ready to move from discussion to action. The morning flight schedule was fixed, and the practical requirements of military operations meant that decisions needed to be made and implemented efficiently. Master Sergeant Martinez, Mitchell said, using her former rank with the natural respect that reflected his recognition of her service and expertise. I believe we've clarified the situation adequately. Sergeant Thompson, please ensure that Master Sergeant Martinez receives priority boarding and that her equipment is properly secured for transport. Thompson straightened with the crisp efficiency of a soldier who had received clear orders from his commanding officer. Yes, sir. Master Sergeant, if you'll follow me, I'll get you situated on the aircraft and brief you on safety procedures for this particular flight. But Sarah noticed something in Thompson's demeanor that suggested he was still processing the complete transformation of his understanding of who she was and what she represented. The shift from seeing her as a civilian outsider to recognizing her as a senior military professional with extensive combat experience was clearly requiring some mental adjustment. Sergeant Thompson, Sarah said, her tone carrying the gentle authority that experienced NCOs used when teaching important lessons to junior soldiers. I appreciate your professionalism throughout this situation. You followed proper procedures and questioned credentials that didn't match your expectations. That's exactly what good soldiers should do. She paused, making sure she had his complete attention before continuing with the point she wanted to emphasize. But I also want you to remember something important about this.